So Madeleine Albright, you may have heard of her. She once said that the the coup of Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran by the CIA-led coup, Operation Ajax, it was called, that deposed the leader of Iran and replaced him with the Shah, essentially. She called that, Trita, remarkably short-sighted by the United States. That's how she described it. What do you, how do you think about 1953? And how should we think about 1953?
I would end up in agreement with Madeleine Albright. Probably doesn't happen too often, but on this one, yes. It was immensely short-sighted. And I think, again, what happens here is that when we were in a Cold War frame, you could justify almost anything on the US side. In fact, this is what happened. The Brits had been pushing the United States to take action against Mossadegh because Mossadegh was doing the unspeakable thing of seeking to make sure that the Iranians would keep 50%
Right.
of the oil that they owned.
Mm-hmm.
The Brits were essentially pumping Iranian oil and keeping all the revenues for themselves. And they offered Iran 10% or 12%. Mossadegh had the audacity of asking for 50%. And he was challenging essentially the manner in which the British were just sucking Iran's wealth out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the US side was not particularly interested at first. It's not until the British discovered a different argument. It's not that they could go and say Mossadegh is a communist, because very clear, Mossadegh was quite hostile to the Soviets and did not want to fall into their orbit. The argument was he can become a communist.
Yeah.
So because he could become a communist, we now had to take action.
Mm-hmm.
And once you put it in the Cold War frame,
right,
it suddenly changed the calculations on the American side. And the United States did this coup. It was in the short term seen as a tremendous success. It cost no more than $10,000. Massive manipulation of another country's politics. But the long term effect is really difficult to underestimate. Up until that point, the United States was actually seen as, correctly, oftentimes on the side of third world countries seeking independence, itself having once fought a war of independence from the British. This changed everything. This is the moment where the United States loses its innocence in Iran. And it ended up being the key factor as to why the Shah reigned for another 25 years. Those last 25 years were the most brutal of his reign.
Mm-hmm.
And why, in the Iranian vocabulary, oftentimes the Shah was referred to as the American Shah. And then we saw the anti-American sentiments of the revolution. And here we are with everything that has been going on. The long-term effects of even a highly successful coup, the blowback of it, is paid for by future generations of Americans and whatever country we have here. And I think it really should be a cautionary tale in general. The United States itself is extremely unforgiving, even when the interference of another country in our political system is simply through Facebook, right? Let's set aside as to whether there was more or less, but we see how important that is as a theme that generates a lot of sentiments. There's no reason to believe that other countries would be any less sensitive and any less unforgiving of that type of interference.
Right.
And in this case, we're talking about someone who, as much as he was quite valuable to the United States in the context of the Cold War, nevertheless was also a very brutal dictator, and who, again, the United States is seen as responsible for many of the sins that the Shah committed. So, it's really hard to see any examples of the United States interfering, manipulating other countries' politics. How that, if you just take a look at it from a utilitarian perspective, is it really useful and helpful in the long run? Forget about the moral dimension of which, I mean, there's no discussion to be had there whatsoever.
Right.
But it's fascinating how oftentimes, because of frames that we tend to obsess over. We find ways to justify things that perhaps under other contexts would not have been acceptable. We know that the United States was rejecting British pushes to do something earlier on, up until that Cold War frame was being used. And then we see now also how we did a lot of things in the Middle East that really do not serve our interests, do not serve the interest of the region in terms of stability, but because of Iran, they were justified. And you can see that in Iran as well. I mean, this is not an American phenomenon of itself. In Israel right now, you can justify almost anything by throwing out either Syria or Iran into the conversation. Right. In Iran, you can do the same thing by throwing in the United States or Israel. Once a couple of entities decide that they're going to obsess over each other, they can end up doing a tremendous amount of damage to themselves. And that's what I think we did with 1953 and many, many of the other interventions.